let me introduce Dr. Tkacz. So it's my great pleasure and honor now to introduce Dr. Catherine Brown Tkacz. Dr. Tkacz is currently a professor of theology at Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine. Dr. Tkacz was the first woman to earn the PhD in medieval studies from the University of Notre Dame. In over 30 years of research, she's focused on women in the church, recovering the mainstream tradition of interpreting women, as well as men, as prefigurations of Christ, explaining the implications of the incarnation for the re-sanctification of the sexes, and assessing historical evidence regarding deaconesses. Her numerous publications on women in the church, including deaconesses, recently led to her appointment to the Vatican Commission on Women in the Diaconate. Dr. Tkacz has over 120 scholarly publications, including 3 monographs, 5 edited volumes, 55 articles, 41 entries, encyclopedic entries, and 21 book reviews. Okay, not a bad career. Some highlights from her work: The Key to the Brescia Casket, Typology and the Early Christian Imagination, Aletheia Hellenike. Okay, there we go. The Authority of the Greek Old Testament, and Nez Perce Hymns and Prayers translated from the Latin by Joseph M. Cataldo. A focal figure for Dr. Tkacz is Susanna, the first woman to be interpreted as a type of Christ and praised as a theologian, learned woman, and saint. It is fitting then that she present here for us tonight her work, Susanna Victrix, Christus Victor, Women as Types of Christ. And without delay, Dr. Tkacz.
Thank you, Daniel, for that gracious introduction. It's a joy to be here with you, and it's a joy to be participating in your Aquinas Week celebration. It's fitting that this talk be given now because, as you'll see soon, Aquinas' clear statement about some of the important theological bases for this typology are directly pertinent. And Aquinas' teacher, Albertus Magnus, on whom my learned and beloved husband will speak on Thursday, contributed a unique element to the discussion of one of the women you'll hear about. Interpreting women as a type of Christ is part of our Christian heritage, specifically the Catholic and Orthodox heritage. It's important to understand the basis theologically for this in order to understand why some peoples have rejected interpreting women in this way. The incarnation is the cause of this typology. This exegesis began in the 1st century as a direct result of the incarnation. God restored humanity through the incarnation. And the Catholic and Orthodox belief is that this is not just saying, okay, you don't have to go to hell. This is saying you were meant to live with God. You were meant to be at home in heaven. Every man, woman, and child is called to this. That's called theosis in Greek, divinization, sanctification. St. Peter writes about this. Christ made it possible for us to become partakers in the divine nature. Athanasius, the Son of God, became man that we might become God. St. Thomas Aquinas, the only begotten Son of God, wanting to make us partakers in his divinity, he's basing this in Peter, assumed our nature so that he made man might make men gods. This is beautifully encapsulated by St. John Paul II as the universal vocation to holiness. Universal because it is part of our divinely created human nature. Being made in the image of God means ultimately that we are meant to be filled with God, so that there is a union there. The first fruits of Jesus' emphasis on the spiritual equality of the sexes were that men and women equally received baptism and the Eucharist, and this was a radical advance over Judaism. Recall that in the temple in Jerusalem, next to the area of sacrifice inside the temple was the men's court. Outside the building was the women's court. And in the practice of the faith, men and boys would recite the Shema. Women were not required to. They were exempt from that. Home devotions were what was expected of women. Jesus changed all this. He elicited a profession of faith from Peter and Martha, only those two. And their responses became the roots of the creed. Because Jesus was not just the Messiah, but was God incarnate, Christians could recognize, as no one had before, that the Old Testament men who pointed to who the Messiah would be, weren't just pointing to a man. They were pointing to God incarnate. They were pointing to the human capacity to be like God. And suddenly, right in the first century, Christians began to recognize in Gentile men such as Melchizedek, and in Jewish women such as Susanna, and in Gentile women such as Jephthah's daughter, prefigurations of Christ. Useful to look at some words about typology. This is a Jewish form of exegesis. Jesus reauthorized it by using it himself. That's why we use it today. That's why we respect it today and find it fruitful. I give you some examples of where he uses prophetic typology, things that pointed to him as the Messiah, but he also opened up a new level of typology. He made himself a type for his followers to imitate. The man who would follow me must take up his cross and follow me daily. I show this 16th century painting from a German convent, which is based on that scripture, which is quoted in German across the bottom, as valuable visible evidence that the masculine generic, the man who, was received generically. You can document that within the Old Testament, within scriptures as a whole. Many people today assume that that was not the case, that the masculine generic only pointed to men. No, there really was a generic masculine. And that's valuable to know. This is why also it wasn't essential in every program of Christian art to have women included, because the basic human identification was as a creature divinely made by God. That preceded any identity politics beyond that. That preceded being male and female. Now, essential to the Catholic and Orthodox churches is the understanding that everyone is called to holiness. My understanding is that this is probably why women were interpreted as types of Christ. This was a powerful way of showing this and inviting people to contemplate that fact. I think it was so innovative that Jesus may have enunciated that himself to his disciples, perhaps on the way to Emmaus. It's so new, it's so different from anything that had gone before. Now, also essential to Catholic and Orthodox is the idea that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, yes, and he is also God incarnate. That idea was repulsive to the Jews. Therefore, of course, they did not interpret women as types of Christ. It's only for those who believe Jesus is God incarnate that it makes sense to interpret women as types of Christ. If you don't think that, it must have seemed odd. Also, to reiterate, the universal vocation to holiness is something believed by the Catholic and the Orthodox, but the Reformers rejected that in the 16th century. They thought the highest that was given to mankind by salvation of Christ was being acceptable, being justified, not being open to being made holy. So for the reformers also, women as types of Christ was not appealing. Luther even went further. He didn't like human types of Christ at all. He tended to go for things as types of Christ, which seems to me showing how far he was removed from the idea that God meant to sanctify his people. Now, 11 biblical women have been interpreted as types of Christ. By the way, I've been working on this for 39 years. I started out with one woman, and gradually 3, and then 5. And the last time I spoke of it in Oxford, I had 8, but now I've got 11. The most important ones are those who begin early and have lasting and full traditions. They prefigure Christ in character and words and actions. Those are the 3 I'm going to focus on mostly, but I want to run through the others just to give you a sense of sort of the landscape of this exegesis, if you will. I emboldened the women we're going to treat in full: Susanna, Jephthah's daughter, and Esther. See, they're all early, by the 5th century. The widow of Zarephath, she's the one who cared for Elijah during the famine. And she happens to say, she is divinely inspired to say, when Elijah asked her for food, "I'm gathering 2 sticks," in Latin, duo ligna, 2 woods, which doesn't imply diminutive. Wood, lignite, same word for tree or for the wood of the cross. "I'm gathering 2 woods to cook the last bit of food we have, and then my son and I will die." Augustine is the first one to say 2 woods. That's very unusual. He sees this as a reference to the cross. And in the High Middle Ages, you see that. You even have, in one case, she's got 2 sticks crossed, and she's carrying them on her back, prefiguring Christ carrying the cross. That's not an overwhelmingly appealing thing to a modern audience. And it was mainly a high medieval interpretation. Ruth, fascinating. After 5 centuries of Christian interpretation of women this way, we have one interpretation by a rabbi of one Jewish woman as prefiguring the Messiah. In his interpretation, Boaz, the kinsman related to the late husband of Ruth, prefigures God, and Ruth prefigures the Messiah. In the account, Boaz says, "Please dip your bread in the vinegar," which is like saying, use condiments with your supper. Vinegar is a positive thing here. The rabbi goes on to say this refers to the suffering the Messiah must endure before he enters his kingdom. And he quotes Isaiah on the suffering servant. These are details Christians associated with Christ, with Jesus Christ. And here you have a rabbi associating them with Ruth. No one ever did anything with that. It could be done today, but no Jewish or Christian exegete followed up on that. Jairus' daughter, the first of the 3 persons whom Jesus restored to life. She's not nearly as strong a type of Christ as is Lazarus, the last one he raised from death, who had been dead so long and actually in the tomb. That's a very striking resurrection. That's the one most frequent. Jairus' daughter is there, but it's not dominant. The woman in the parable who finds the lost drachma, the drachma has the image of the ruler on it. And in the Greek church, consistently, it's primarily in Greek you find this, the idea was that the woman in the household who seeks the lost coin represents the wisdom and power of God, looking for the lost coin, the lost mankind with the image of God. And that gets developed in great detail. So that she seeks with the light on the lampstand, and that represents the crucifixion in some Greek versions. Judith and Jael I want to treat together. They are like David defeating Goliath. These are unexpected conquerors of the leader of the enemy. The boy David defeated the soldier Goliath. Judith cut off the head of Holofernes with his own sword. Jael used a tent peg to slay the general who was asleep in her tent. Christians took this sometimes as a reference to what Christ accomplished by the crucifixion. He defeated the enemy. And beyond expectation, he defeated the enemy. Nobody would have predicted that this would happen. The next two are late arrivals, and I think they're pretty flimsy, even lame. The beloved of the Song of Songs is already a type of the soul in relation to Christ, or of the church in relation to Christ. And to say that the soul then represents Christ is a little muddy. There's just one verse, the beloved goes out to seek for the beloved, and the night watch tear at her clothes. And that's taken in this one manuscript as a prefiguration of the stripping of Christ before the crucifixion. Didn't follow up on that. There's no commentary on that. I think it's pretty lame. And finally, the widow who gave her mite. I think this is free association. She gave of her bios, Greek, bios, the same word that's in biology. But that doesn't mean life in the New Testament. It means the living, a living wage, something like that. That's how it's used a number of times in the Gospels. And when you have a reference to the soul of a person, the life of a person, Christ on the cross, it's pneuma. Greater love hath no man than this, that he give up his psyche, his soul. It's not bios. So I think that's just a flimsy one. So now you've seen all 11, and now we'll go on with the three who are really powerful. And the earliest, I was working on this for 5 years before I discovered this aspect of it. In the whole of the Bible, only two persons have 33 parallels in experience. And some of the most important are that each was arrested in a garden. Each was tried unjustly when, quote, the elders of the people came together intending to condemn to death Susanna, Jesus. The person was actually condemned to death by the false testimony of two witnesses and suffered through 2 trials. In each case, the judge at the second trial made a public statement, and the statements are identical. I am innocent of the blood of this one. And then when death was near, Susanna, as she's being led to execution, and Jesus, when he is on the cross, quote, cried out in a great voice, Susanna, Jesus, saying, God. These are remarkable parallels. And the early church knew them. These parallels are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And 17 of the parallels are expressed through direct verbal borrowings. 52 words are borrowed from Susanna's history in narrating the Passion of Christ in Matthew. Susanna's ordeal was nothing less than the template for the Passion narrative. The person from the Old Testament who may be the most significant type of Christ in the narration of the Gospels is a married woman with children. Well, that's powerfully affirmative of women and of motherhood and of humanity as a whole. And this got preached on. Augustine, Jerome, Maximus of Turin, Ambrose, these are not fly-by-night guys. These are some of the biggies of the church, right? The doctors. Maximus had 2 sermons in Holy Week. That was the first text that I found on this, his sermons. On Holy Thursday, he compared Susanna in the garden to Christ in Gethsemane. On Good Friday, he compared Susanna at her trial to Christ before Pilate. He called Susanna bis Victrix, 2 times the conquering woman, because she thwarted the elders in the garden and she conquered them in overcoming their condemnation of her to death. And he calls Christ Victor. It's pretty good stuff. Now, I mentioned before that the Jews did not share the belief that Jesus was God incarnate. And without that belief, it makes no sense to interpret a woman as a type of Christ. And for Christians, Susanna was a very important type of Christ. Very important. She also shows up in art very early on in this role. They actually removed her history from the book of Daniel. Other reasons have been suggested over the years, but I think this is the real reason. I think you've just heard the real reason. There was a Jewish scholar in 1975, Bernard Jackson, who said, well, they must have seen how badly the elders of the people came off in that, and that would be enough reason to suppress this account. I think it's far more than that, far more than that. And this is one of many changes that Jews began to make in the actual Hebrew scriptures, starting in the 1st century. This went on for centuries and culminated in the 11th century in the Masoretic text as it is known today. This is the only case, the history of Susanna, the Bible, the Old Testament, this is the only case where for an ancient text, a medieval edition is preferred to all the ancient versions. It was a theological reason which drove this. And it's fascinating to me that it affected all the women who have clear traditions as a type of Christ. Now, early in the church, there were regional lectionaries. There was one in Spain, there was one in Rome, there was one in Milan. Different parts of the world had different lectionaries. And by the 4th century, Susanna was in those during Holy Week. All those places, she was in Holy Week, usually on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. And then when the church for the West came up with a unified lectionary for the entire Western church, she was there. And this is fascinating to me. She's in the Synoptic Gospels. That's what most people were preaching about. But Augustine had preached on her in connection with the I am the light of the world sermon, in which the issue of witnesses comes up, because the people who don't believe in him say, well, they're talking about how many witnesses, and he says, well, they accuse him of being a witness for himself. So the issue of witnesses comes up, and Augustine makes the comparison with Susanna. And that's what determined the pairing in the lectionary. Just a little sidebar. Nowadays, when you hear that lectionary pairing, you often hear the woman taken in adultery. That came after this pairing. When this pairing was instituted in the late 5th century, the woman taken in adultery was not there in that gospel. She had 7 different positions in 3 different gospels. It was the only text I know of that was moving around, and they didn't have a fixed position. And I think because Susanna was a woman falsely accused of adultery and delivered divinely and justly, people thought, well, that's a good place to give the account of Jesus taking a woman who was justly accused of adultery and mercifully delivered. They make nice contrasts there. That was not preached on until the last few centuries. People were preaching on other aspects of Susanna until then. Now, this is where I first saw that it looked awfully much like a woman was a type of Christ. This is a 4th century artwork, northern Italy, beautifully carved in ivory. And you can see the entire surfaces are covered with these depictions. Every side has one, or on the lid, 2 New Testament registers, and those are the tall ones. And on all the vertical surfaces, 2 narrow Old Testament surfaces. Here's the lid. Can you hear me well enough if I walk? Okay. Can you record me if I walk over?
We'll lose you with that.
I'm sorry?
We'll lose your audio.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll point. On the lid, on the far left, on the top, Christ in Gethsemane, the garden indicated by 2 trees. Next, Christ about to be arrested. Bottom register, the 2 trials of Christ. Notice that in the second one on the right, Pilate is washing his hands. That's what he does when he says the words that had been spoken earlier by Daniel. And you have Jesus there, held in a position of arrest at that trial. Here's the front. Look at the bottom register, go to the left. We have here a brilliant synthesis of each of those registers in the two scenes. On the far left, Susanna in a garden represented by two trees with the elders rushing up to arrest her. Christ in Gethsemane and the rest. And then a trial of Susanna with Daniel seated with a gesture of speech recalling his words. This is exactly what Maximus of Turin preached on Holy Thursday and Good Friday. And this was carved within 20, 30 years of that sermon in northern Italy, we think, which is not too far from where Maximus was preaching. So when I saw this, I thought she has to be a type of Christ, but I didn't find a text. It took me 6 months to find those sermons. But then that's what I found first, those sermons. If I'd found St. Augustine, it would have taken me a lot longer. Also on the back, which I'm not showing you, we have in the top register the 3 Old Testament figures from the front who are types of Christ. I've only spoken about Susanna. She and Jonah and Daniel are all in the top register in the back, all depicting Christ after the resurrection. She is aurat between 2 trees, and there are no elders around. This is the glorious resurrection. And the other figures are other aspects. And you see Susanna at the top of this gold glass piece, aurat between 2 trees, so representing Christ in his resurrection. I like to include this too because it shows the Jewish garments. Striped fabric in early Christian art was a way of representing Jewish garments. Albert the Great, the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, in his commentary on Daniel, compared Susanna walking in her enclosed garden, the Paradisum, to God walking in Eden in Genesis, the original Paradisum. The tradition of Susanna was that she was holy and prayerful and valiant, and Albert responded to that tradition and described her as a typus Dei, not typus Christi, not figura Christi. It's the only case I know of where a woman is called a type of God. Now, starting around 1300 in the West, we have a whole new genre that arises, manuscripts that have commentaries, and every commentary is illustrated. There were 6 works in this genre, and one of the very most popular was called, by a modern name, the Biblia Pauperum, Bible of the Poor, which is a really dumb name for it. The idea was it's got all these pictures, it must be for poor people who didn't know how to read. Except it's got inscriptions and commentaries on every page in Latin, and maybe in Greek or French too, or Dutch. So it's not for the poor, but these were great aids to sermons. They influenced the art in tapestries, in stained glass windows. Now, here's an example from the 15th century, which I find admirable in layout. On the top, there's always a depiction of Christ central and in the largest area on the page. He's framed by 4 prophecies, and those would have a bust portrait of the prophet and a scroll, and it would refer to the event depicted of Christ. And below Christ, and in the sort of the intermediary sized areas, are 2 Old Testament types of the event of Christ shown. And below the Old Testament types, there's a verse caption, and underneath that, a full commentary explaining the typology. I give you this because this is the only genre I know of in which up to 4 women could be depicted as types of Christ in an individual work. And here's one of the women, one of the 4 women in this manuscript. This is Susanna. By the way, notice that she's fully clad. poised, in control. She's shown taller than the men. She's often either taller or given a more prominent position so that her head is above the head of the men. This is a very subtle way of showing her superiority, her moral and intellectual dominance, and her sanctity as well. And you can see the end of the robe of Christ as he kneels in Gethsemane. This is Susanna being surprised by the elders in the garden in Gethsemane with a scroll with her words on it. Now, for 9 years or more, I thought, I'm surprised that nobody ever took the rest of Susanna's prayer and made a comparison there. And then finally I found it. In 1375, a Franciscan priest, Father Johann, preached a sermon during Lent, and it became enormously popular. And here's one of the examples from later on. And it begins with her quotation of her words, and I'm going to take you now to my translation. Behold, I die, although I have done none of the things which they have maliciously, falsely testified against me. Clearly, St. Susanna originally said these words when she had been condemned to death by false testimony. Because of her innocence, however, she was delivered from this condemnation. I can suggest that the above words were a prelude to the Passion of Christ, a new way of expressing typology. I've never seen that before. Christ, whom false and envious Jews condemned to death, who similarly triumphed against them by rising gloriously from vanquished death. Notice the language of triumph, conquering. That's typically associated with Susanna up through this period. In these words is shown the benevolence and innocence of Christ in his death. And it's these commentaries, it was Father Johann who introduced the discussion of the innocence of Susanna and the perfect innocence of Christ as another point of comparison between them. You see a flowering of the tradition. It's growing organically from the biblical comparisons, from the likeness of character, but you're finding new details and new visual expressions as well. There are over 60 manuscripts that have sermons that begin with Susanna's prayers and continue, the Lord could have said the same words hanging on the cross. Now, she's an ideal type of Christ. Her character, her words, her action, all of those fit with her being a type of Christ. She has a true and coherent tradition, and it lasted, and it continues. You're going to see some near the end of some new developments. But I want to point now to the continuity in types. Because these were validly based, these were reasonable interpretations, they persisted through the centuries. And you saw the two types of Christ that Susanna presented on the front of the breccia casket. Here they are again in the 16th century, completely different medium. This is a dalmatic, and you can see on the back those gold bands have 3 medallions that are embroidered. It takes you from the triumphal entry in Jerusalem through the prayer in Gethsemane. And then look on the sleeves. On the front of the sleeves, you have the arrest of Christ and the trial of Christ. Down the front, again, you have more of those medallions. All of those are types relating to Christ and to the Eucharist, related to his passion. Therefore, the only 2 types on the front which match up with the types on the sleeves are Susanna. And they're the same 2 depictions, the same 2 points of comparison seen in the breccia casket and in the sermons by Maximus of Turin. Here's Christ arrested. Now, notice that the artist has a horizontal shape here. And now that he goes to the front, he has to change the composition to fit upright. That accounts for some of the differences in what you see. But it's very clear when you look especially at the trial. Christ, and his hands are bound at the wrist. A guard holds the rope behind him. The judge is seated on a throne. A green drapery sets off the royal nature of the judge. Exactly the same details you see in this depiction of Susanna. When a communicant went forward to receive the Eucharist, that person would be able to see this medallion and the sleeve. What do you make a bet that the man who wore that would preach on this typology? I mean, how could you resist preaching on that? Now we go to another woman known through the Gospels. As a type of Christ. She's a Gentile, and her history is painful. She is known through the book of Judges. Like Isaac, she was a beloved child. Both of them were taken for sacrifice by their fathers, but Isaac was divinely spared. Uniquely, she, of the two of them, is described as only begotten in the scriptures. And that's a word, as you well know, is used of Christ. So she's the only example in Scripture of a beloved, only begotten child who is in fact sacrificed. And one Orthodox scholar has recently said that makes her a perfect type of Christ, because she was in fact sacrificed as he was. Now the language descriptive of Jephthah's daughter, we see in God's, the Father's words of and to Jesus at the Transfiguration and at the baptism. God calls him beloved. And Jesus, in his parable of the vineyard, reaffirms this himself of himself. The beloved only begotten one who is slain. This tradition is mainly in Greek, Syriac, and Latin. I'll skip down to the second part. Methodius calls her ewe lamb, led to the altar and newly slaughtered, using the language of Isaiah 53 on the lamb led to slaughter. The fullest discussion is in Syriac by Dionysius Bar Celebi. Every verse that recounts something of her history, he specifically takes and relates to Christ. And an important detail here is before she was actually slaughtered, she went up into the mountains with her maiden friends, and they wept over her. And Dionysius said, this is like the women of Jerusalem who wept over Christ. This is depicted early. It's fascinating. In Western art, you have typology depicted directly. That's not characteristic of Eastern art. It's by placement. You have the actual altar where the Mass was celebrated at St. Catherine's at Mount Sinai. And on the left is the painting of Isaac, and on the right is the painting of Jephthah's daughter. And notice they're symmetrical, so they're facing toward the place of sacrifice. There's not a depiction of Christ's sacrifice. There's the reenactment on the altar. And you have the same, this is 5th century. In the 12th century, at the monastery of St. Anthony at the Red Sea, you have the same pairing. And this is in what's called the haikals. It's a sort of a canopy over the altar. So again, these are flanking the altar. Christ is not depicted, Christ is present in the Eucharist. Now back to that one manuscript, because I'm going to show you the best statement in Latin of her typology. And those of you who know Latin will enjoy this. Prefigured, go to the last word in the sentence, prefigured the only begotten Son of God. That is pithy. That is so clear. And by the way, there's a pun in this. No, I shouldn't. That would be indulgent. Excuse me, I'm just going to try and dump this out and find a lozenge. Of course, it's at the bottom. Okay, and now for the third woman. Esther, praying in agony. Only 2 persons in the Bible are described as praying in agony. Esther does that when she is going to risk her life for the sake of the people. I've got some water. I need to be up. Thank you so much. That was very thoughtful of you. And she prays in agony of death. By the way, like Christ, her identity is hidden from people. She is Jewish, and most people don't know that. And people don't know that Christ is divine. So there's another point of similarity between them. Now, the earliest Roman lectionary pairs Esther's prayer when she expresses to God her willingness to risk her life with Jesus declaring to his disciples that he's going to Jerusalem to suffer and die. That is clearly typological. And yet, I have not found a single sermon or commentary on this. There is very little early Christian writing on the book of Esther. And there's a strong reason for this. Well, I guess I'll come back to that. We do have other things in Western tradition that indicate how you can depict Esther in this way. And the fact that her identity was hidden, and that she would accomplish the delivery of the people, that was seen as a point of comparison. Also, when Esther does go before the king, and that was illegal. If you were not called to go before the king, he could have you killed like that. And she swoons in terror. A swoon is an imitation of death that could have been interpreted as an actual death. And it may have been. Here's an image at Bergamo in a section of the choir where all the depictions are typological. Susanna is there as a type of Christ. And here is Esther swooning. It could be that she's meant to represent the death of Christ, but I don't have any text. And so it's only a hunch and not evidence. So why was Esther neglected? Already at the time of Christ, she was important in the Jewish liturgical year. Purim is the feast that is associated with Esther. It has to do with the delivery of the people from what would have been their mass execution, and she is the cause of their deliverance. So for Christians to see her as prefiguring Christ was, again, a repellent idea. It was like they were trying to take the tradition away. I've got a separate article on the role of Jesus in connection with the psalm he quotes from the cross. By the 3rd century, every verse of that psalm is associated with Christ and his passion. Well, by the 5th century, every verse in that psalm is associated with Esther. And they really have to stretch to make some of it fit, because there's not a natural correlation, as there is with Jesus. The celebration of Purim by the Jews during the early Christian era took on anti-Christian elements, including something that looks like the execution of Christ, which is in place of the execution of the man who wanted to murder the Jews. So Christ was taken as related to the greatest enemy of the Jews. And Susanna's history was taken out. Half of Esther's book was taken out. So many chapters were taken out. Virtually everything that relates to her as a type of Christ was removed. And also elements that stress the relationship of God with the people was removed. The book of Esther is now famous for not using the word God. Well, it does. It does in the Septuagint. And in all the prayers that mentions God. But those references were all cut out from the Masoretic text. And that really tamped down the interpretation of Esther as a type of Christ. But there's no reason it could not be developed today. Why are female types of Christ not known today? The 16th century, who'd have thought? Misogyny and loss of faith. Two things changed. There had been periodically times when the Latin West recovered classical culture. The Carolingian Renaissance was one of them. And the period of Albert the Great was another, when manuscripts were greatly studied from the West. But always when this happened, there was a clear distinction between Christian interpretation and pagan morality. For instance, Augustine made such a big distinction between Lucretia, who killed herself, which was wrong, and Susanna, who risked death but would never have killed herself. And that distinction between the wrongfulness of a suicide out of a pagan sense of honor and the Christian sense of the value of human life and the innocence of a victim of sexual assault, that was lost in the 16th century. Suddenly, Lucretia is just as important as the saints of the Old Testament in art. And this blind praise of classicism also led to prizing classical models, including the nude models. This is when the clothes came off Susanna. Always before, she was poised, fully clad, in charge of the situation, which fits the biblical text. But in the 16th century, her clothes start to come off. And by the end of the century, you have the first pornographic depiction of Susanna, with her naked and the elders with hands on her. That's a radical change. That's a radical introduction of misogyny into Western culture. And once you take the clothes off a woman, you're not paying that much attention to her character. And typology was lost for those who depicted her that way. She was still depicted sometimes as a type of Christ, still in the traditional manner, fully clothed, poised, in charge, but not always. So that was part of it. The Renaissance art and the blind acceptance of pagan classical values. But also the Reformation rejected the idea of theosis, of sanctification. And once you lose that, you lose the basis for seeing that men and women, Jew and Gentile, everyone can prefigure Christ and can aspire to be fully holy. If you lose that context, the rationale for women as types of Christ evaporates. Now, there is some modern revival. Susanna, there are some new sermons. Some are by priests who hear my scholarship. For instance, Father Paul Vivek in my home parish, every year he preaches on her in a different way, and it's all based in the tradition. In Ukraine and in England and elsewhere in the U.S., as a result of this work of mine, Susanna is preached. There are spontaneous Susanna sermons by people who are looking at the biblical texts. My favorite is the Maltese Carmelite, who is using new elements from comparison he makes. He's the first one to draw on her name as lily and comparing that with Christ as pure as a lily. And he points out some traditional comparisons which he appears to have gotten simply from reading the biblical texts. This is the village in the Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine, where I was invited to give my talk on Susanna as a type of Christ. I gave them the full details on the Greek scriptures because these are Greek Catholics. And one of the priests walked in 20 miles from a neighboring village for this. And the young man you see there seated by the table with the PowerPoint, he is giving translation. I would speak a sentence or two and he would translate. Most of the audience had English, but not maybe enough to be sure of it. The man on the right is the priest of the village. Also, this is the first ever icon of the crucifixion and the righteous Susanna. And this was done by a 17-year-old student of mine who knew about the Brescia casket. And look how imaginative this is, how completely well thought this is. And she, as on the icon, they're quoting from the scriptures the parallels between Susanna and the Matthew account of the Passion. Albert Paretsky, a Dominican priest, is the only person I know of who preaches on Susanna, on Jephthah's daughter, as a type of Christ. And the material I gave you about the use of Jephthah's daughter in transfiguration and baptism, that's from his dissertation at the Angelicum. Judith, in response to my work, an Orthodox nun published a meditation on Judith as a type of Christ. And this I find exciting. The scholarly archbishop who founded this large extended Orthodox community invited me in to speak on women in the church, and I gave a full-day seminar on the 8 women I then knew were types of Christ. And a few years later, one of the priests there commissioned the first Orthodox hymn about Esther as a type of Christ. The beleaguered nation didst thou rescue from the clutches of the foolish monarch, O thou righteous queen and daughter of Israel, for thou, foreshadowing the passion of Christ, didst put in peril thy life for thy people's sake. I find this very exciting, that in response to the work I've done, there is a new growth in this typology. Beyond that, I want to conclude by saying this is valuable for what it helps us focus on in terms of theosis and the universal vocation to holiness. But also this shows the vibrant, long-standing Christian tradition of presenting these women as very positive, powerful, articulate. Their words are so often the basis for the typology. So this is very much something that I hope will revive more fully, and that I hope will take a role in your own meditations in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine. I have to say it's humbling to see someone so frighteningly learned express this, process of learning more, that there are more female types of Christ. What hope is there for me? Okay. I think we have time for questions. Is that okay?
I love it.
Excellent. So I think now one issue is we don't have a mic to pass around right now. So if you want to ask a question, if you could raise your hand, I think I'll let you field, if that's okay. And we do have bodyguards in the audience, so if things get out of hand, you know what to do. And you can field the questions, and then just please stand and project yourself. And you might need to repeat. Yes, your voice. Yes, that could be problematic. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's when security comes. Okay. Okay. So I'll let you field. Go ahead.
And you'll just have to signal me, or I'll keep going all night.
Okay.
Okay, I'd be delighted to hear any comments or questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Question for you. Is there any rabbinic tradition, pre-Christian rabbinic tradition, you can say that, I guess, interpreting Esther as, because her story in the book of Daniel is kind of odd, or it's maybe disproportionate. Daniel is such a tiny figure in the story of Susanna. Is there any tradition that the Jews have in interpreting her in that story?
Let's see now. I'm just going to pull things from memory as they come. One of the elements is the Jewish tradition of placing her in the families of the Old Testament. They considered her to be the sister of Jeremiah. So, a prophetic family. And in some traditions, her husband, Joachim, was the king of Jerusalem who was conquered by the Babylonians who took them into exile. And in another strand of tradition, they look at the elders and identify them with two figures cited by one of the prophets. And I think it's Ezekiel, but I don't remember the details. But that's where you get the names for a pair of elders who were nefarious. And that shows up in the Western medieval tradition of plays, of mystery plays. You'll find those names used for those men sometimes. In the pre-Christian book of Daniel, the reason we have Susanna as chapter 13 is that Jerome made a unilateral decision. He was brilliant, he was holy, he was good, but I think he goofed on this one. The original book of Daniel has 14 chapters. And in it, the first chapter is Susanna, her history. And Daniel is a very young boy. It's not just puer, it's something that means younger than that. Next chapter is when the three young boys and Daniel are being taken for education, and they're all a little older. And it's after that you have, so this fits the life of Daniel to have her first. It fits the prophecy too, but you don't find, as far as I know, any Jewish commentary on that, so I'll not go on to that. But one thing I can't resist, because it's so beautiful. In the original book of Daniel, 7 chapters which are narrative about events during the Babylonian captivity, and 7 chapters narrating visions. And this 7-chapter first half, first Susanna, 1, 2, 3. The 3 young men, 1, 2, 3. Daniel in the lion's den. These have parallels. Hero for God, faced with an unjust death, unless willing to act against one's character and beliefs. Refusal to do that, faced with horrific death, divinely rescued, an angel is involved in the rescue, and the phrase, the hand of, meaning in the power of, is used, freed from the hand of the king, or she's going to be in the hands of the elders. The hands of the lions, I love that one. There's a strong symmetry here. You have 3 prefigurations, 3 chapters apart. Numbers matter so much in Scripture and in the book of Daniel. That is lost if you take Susanna out. And you also have, the other chapters have symmetry. I have an article on that, too, in Heathrop Journal. Yes?
So, you mentioned that this took, like, a long time. I think you said, like, 30 years. And you mentioned, like, all these sources from over thousands of years in, like, random little areas of Italy. How did you go about researching and, like, finding all these random sermons and great details?
The question is, how did I find all this stuff? When I saw the image on the Brescia casket, this was before there were textual databases. There were series of editions, great big series with hundreds of volumes in them. I happened to work at Harvard University's Research Center, and my office was right next to the library, and I spent half an hour every lunch period. And it took me 6 months. What I started out with was Patrologia Latina, and I was skimming the base of the page for references to the book of Daniel. And it took me all that time to find this. As I developed knowledge of what was involved in the typology, and as databases became available, I began to look for, I would search by phrases. Susanna's words that are quoted in all those sermons, ecce morior. I searched for ecce moria, Susanna, and Christ, and I found some things that way. Things developed over time, and I was able to use more. Using that material, I actually found a digitized manuscript with a sermon that used that, but associated with that was somebody's Latin transcription of the manuscript. But I also was looking in a variety of things. I thought, what are the largest things I can get at? I looked at major databases on Susanna, databases. These were like the Princeton Index of Christian Art, which was a card catalog system at that time. I went through all the Susanna material there. I looked up everything on Susanna, and I also, I think it was when I was working in I'm trying to reconstruct this, I was sort of omnivorous for possibilities. And I would look in books, like there is a major series of volumes that intends to produce a catalog of all the extant medieval stained glass. And volumes by countries and by church and this, that, and the other. And most of them had an index at the back. And I was looking for Susanna and all those, and I thought, I'm going to start looking for all the women whom I think might be capable of being construed that way. And I had a list of about a dozen women. And so I would look for that as well. And on some things, it's just because as I knew a little bit about it, I knew what to look for. There's an absolutely atrocious book, and I'm going to block out the name. It's by an artist who he's obsessed with depicting Susanna naked and with talking about her in degrading ways. It's Jean-Claude Pretre, and he has a whole volume about Suzanne. And I looked through it because he had many, many, many depictions of Susanna, and one of them was just a little tiny black and white depiction of Susanna arrested, and it said it was from a vestment. And I thought, there is no reason for her to be on a vestment unless she's a type of Christ. And I was able to get a research grant, and I went to Europe, and I saw all kinds of manuscripts. I transcribed commentaries from those. I talked about the Biblia Pauperum. I transcribed lots of commentaries about her and described for myself the images. And I was able in Louvain, in Louvain, I went to the place where they had the vestment, and they brought it out of storage for me to study. And I saw what you saw, and I commissioned those photographs. And I think those photographs, are going to be reproduced in my book on women as types of Christ, which is in press, but it should come out this year. So I kept learning more how to search for things, and I learned how to search in a variety of languages. And the more I knew about a commentary, for instance, for the Widow of Zarephath, her words are very important. So I just searched for her words. Lo, I am gathering 2 woods. And I found some things that way. And I also looked for things that I have not yet panned out. But it took me all those years to find those sermons. And once I found one sermon, it led to several others. And most of those, nobody has talked about them as a group before. Nobody has talked about women as types of Christ as a phenomenon. When I began work, there were 3 feminists who had published in the 1980s saying that women could not be types of Christ. And it was because the church was bad and patriarchal. Well, I like showing that, look, there's a lot more going on than you have any idea of here. So that was a long answer, but basically you have to be creative. Oh, one thing I want to throw out too. I came up with a rule for myself. This was a new project of research. And I said to myself, it's not enough to have an image without a text. The image can be plausible, but without a text, can't prove it. It isn't positively proven for the Brescia casket, but I think all the evidence is so overwhelming that it's convincing. I saw a depiction of the widow of Zarephath holding up a cross. And it was from a manuscript, a unique manuscript of a work called On the Praises of the Cross, De Laudibus Sanctae Crucis. And I thought, she looks like a type of Christ. But the manuscript wasn't published. I bought a microfilm of it. And all these opening pages have all these biblical figures, men and women, each one black and white drawing, and a little tiny red cross in there to show you this is being shown, this is about the cross. And 2 or 3 of them looked like they were women as types of Christ. And then I read the commentary, which fills the rest of the manuscript, and each of those women was taken as a type of the church. So it looked like it, but it was the sticks that were the type of the cross, and she was not the type of Christ. So one has to be careful. Yes, Father.
Yeah, thanks so much. Very interesting. When I think of women in the Old Testament or female, like representing Christ, I immediately think of Lady Wisdom.
Okay.
And I mean, like, interpretation of Lady Wisdom was huge in the Christological debates in the early church.
Yes.
So could you maybe say a little bit about Lady Wisdom and Christological readings and why you don't include that character as a type of Christ too?
Well, my primary interest was in actual women. And then if Jesus used a woman in a parable, that's sort of my second tier interest. For Lady Wisdom, I see a kinship with the way that the woman who finds the drachma is interpreted. Because you have direct Greek statements. She is the power and wisdom of Christ. And you have that consistently from 5th through 12th century. But I don't see anybody saying she is Lady Wisdom. They're focusing immediately on Christ. And that seems to me very powerful in itself. I think it's a related but a separate area. So that's why I haven't pursued that one.
Sure.
But certainly that is a fascinating area, and the whole role of personifications in Scripture is valuable. And this makes me think of a tangent, too.
I love tangents.
So do I. Usually typology, and typology is just a form of reasoning by analogy, after all. Usually it's what I call sexually consonant, so that a man prefigures a man and a woman prefigures a woman. There are some exceptions. For St. Augustine, the one person that Augustine calls most often a figura ecclesiae is St. Peter. And I think it's because he's the rock on which the church was founded. But that's very rare to have a man be a type of a female personification. And for a woman to prefigure Christ, it's because of his transcendent divinity that that's possible. And if it weren't for that, it wouldn't make sense to people. And for people who don't believe in that, that's why they reject it.
Thank you.
Surely. Yes, John.
I had just an art question. I'm curious. I think Susanna's on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in clothes, and on the colonnade at St. Peter's also in clothes. And I was wondering if you've read any. Michelangelo wrote a lot, and I don't know if he wrote about Susanna. He didn't always paint people in clothes. As you know. I'm just curious about those two, because I don't know who all else is on the the colonnade, if they're saints and popes and
Whoa.
Susanna, but I thought
I don't know that.
okay.
I don't know that. Susanna, Michelangelo has a Susanna there. Okay. I know that in the Sistine Chapel, in two of the pendentives, and I didn't know that word, and those are little triangular shaped curved areas that come down from the ceiling in the corners. You have David beheading Goliath and Judith beheading Holofernes as twin types of what Christ accomplished.
Maybe she's not, if you don't know that.
I kind of suspect she's not, because I've been looking at this stuff a long time. But there are places where sometimes, I remember Father Albert Paretsky, the Dominican, told me that at Akhtamar in Armenia, the depictions I showed at Sinai of Isaac and Jephthah's daughter, he said they're at Armenia. So I had to look at that stuff. And they're not a pair there. But it's a good reason for doing it differently. So I had to analyze that whole program to figure out what was going on. Isaac, there was a Saint Isaac of an aristocratic family in Armenia, and the sacrifice of Isaac was by this Isaac of Armenia. So that's why she didn't get there. But whenever you expect someone to be there and she's not, that's worth looking at. I'm going to look up Michelangelo again, though, and if I find out, I'll let you know. Yes.
So, thank you for your presentation. I think it's very special how illuminating it is for the dignity of the woman. Could you speak on maybe how it's influenced your spirituality or maybe your prayer life? Has it had any influences during your study?
What a good question. Well, I never prayed to Susanna before, and I do now. In looking at Susanna as a type of Christ, I had to look at her whole tradition. And that's where I recovered the fact that the early church considered her a theologian. They take her prayer, which begins, "O eternal God, who knows all things, who knowest hidden things before they happen," and they use her as one who knows the omniscience of God and the eternity of God, and present her as a theologian. The Origen says Susanna teaches us. I think it's the eternity of God is what he's referring to there. And I was seeing that's where I got the Susanna Victrix. Over and over, I was seeing all these positive presentations of her as valiant in what she undertook. And in discussions of the psychology of sin, she was shown as very wise. The elders, when they approach her, show really bad theology. They have forgotten so much. They say, "The gates are locked, no one will see us. We both want you. Give in to us, or we will say you were here to meet a young man." So she knows, because of her learning, that that's a death threat. Two men are threatening to falsely accuse her of adultery. She has no corroborating witness. Mosaic law did not allow for a defense in that situation. And she replies, paraphrasing King David when he faced a difficult choice. Paraphrasing King David, not quoting some other woman, but the ruler of the whole people. And she concludes by saying, "But it's better for me without sin to fall into your hands than to sin in the sight of God." So they said, "No one will see us," and she's saying, "In the sight of God." And the whole theme of sight is very strong in that. I think Susanna has been a joy to me in my meditation on this. And I've also had a sense that a joy in my work is I feel a little like Daniel sometimes. All these feminist biblical scholars are saying terrible things about Susanna. She was pampered, she was selfish, she was spineless. They discard her reasons. They ignore her reasons and say she was blindly enslaved to the idea that her husband's honor was more important than her life. She never says a word about her husband. Never. You don't find that in any text about her until, I think it's the 13th century in a play. And she's saying a lot more. Everybody says a lot more in a play than you do in the short Semitic biblical narratives. And there she mentions her husband, but he comes way after God. And the thought that my work can help recover the actual woman is very appealing. And I say the actual woman because there's no reason to doubt her existence. It's been a popular trend in the 20th century to say if there's a plausible reason for thinking that somebody from the Bible is fictitious, probably so. And if somebody's name has significance, that's reason to doubt that they're real. Jewish people were named to have meaningful names. So it's a loaded argument. So I like vindicating her or participating in the vindication of her. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Laura. Yes.
I wonder what if you have anything to say about the mother of the Maccabees. I don't know if it's hard to run it with her. Thoughts on that?
The mother of the Maccabees, often called Salome, I've never seen her taken as a type of Christ. Heroic. And it is striking to me that you have and this is a 2nd century Greek original text about the Maccabees. She is described as having reason as strong as a man. And that notion of the full strength, I don't see that as demeaning to her. I see that as finding in her way unexpected strength. And if you look at the account, here's this woman and the pagan ruler expects she's going to cave and help him intellectually seduce her last surviving son. But he doesn't know Hebrew, and she apparently knows Hebrew and Greek. And she talks to her son in Hebrew and exhorts him learnedly about the faith. And then she, along with her 7 sons, ends up being executed. So she's very much taken as heroic. And by the way, in the early church, the Maccabees were universally, east and west, in the calendar of saints. And St. Augustine writes about them as Christians in occultu, Christians in secret. They didn't know Christ by name, but they were clearly God's. I have looked, and I haven't found anything, but I haven't looked. After a while, if I'm looking on a woman and I don't find anything, I stop looking for her as a type of Christ. Yes, please.
You said in response to another question about St. Augustine commenting on, correct me if I say this improperly, but St. Peter having to do with women as the image of Christ. What text does St. Augustine talk about that?
Actually, it's not quite that. I was saying that St. Augustine uses Peter as the one person he most frequently calls a figure or type of the church. Augustine does not speak directly of women as types of Christ. He doesn't use that phrasing. And the sermon I referred to where he's comparing Susanna and the witnesses to I'm the light of the world sermon by Christ and the discussion of witnesses that follows that. That's not very long. I think that's about 5-6 sentences. It's not a whole full-fledged sermon. Not all of the church fathers do treat women as types of Christ. And in some cases, you'll find there'll be a sermon that has sort of a catalog of types. And you'll find brief treatments of several of them. That was sort of a sprawling answer to you. But I had wished that he did more, but then he does so much that's so wonderful. I don't mind a bit, really. Thank you.
Okay, maybe one more, Regina?
Well, are there any women that you're currently still looking into and still researching as types of Christ, or is this your complete list?
Well, I never stopped looking. And I've looked for some that I have not found. At this point, I don't expect to find any new ones, but I look in places where a woman is treated as a type of Christ, and that is sometimes a place where maybe another woman is treated as a type of Christ. Incidentally, this is a complete tangent, but I think you'll like this. I've been asked to design a program for the stained glass in one of the parish churches in a small town in Washington. And we've been working it out, and they like the program, and it's going to be types of Christ and his passion. And we'll have more women than in any other typological program. It's going to have 5 or 6, and a corresponding number of men. The tangent again, there's no need to have a fully typological program that's exclusively women, although you could do it, because both sexes represent our common humanity. But I think it's just beautiful to draw on the tradition and express it a little more fully. But yes, I keep looking. If you come across anything that looks intriguing, or if you think of something that I haven't thought of, that I haven't mentioned, there are some I've thought of I didn't mention, ask me, and I'll tell you what I found if I found anything.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Regina.
I think that's a great place to stop. So please give me, join me in giving Dr. Tkacz a round of applause.